Hello, everybody. In this episode, I'll be speaking with Elizabeth Seger. Elizabeth completed her PhD in Philosophy of Science at Cambridge in 2022 and is now a researcher at the Center for Governance of AI in Oxford, where she works on AI democratization and open source AI regulation. She recently led the production of a large report on the risks and benefits of model sharing, which we will talk about in this episode. For links to what we're discussing, you can check the description of the episode, and you can read the transcript at axrp.net. Well, Elizabeth, welcome to the podcast.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Cool. So we're going to be talking about a couple of papers basically about democratizing and open sourcing AI. When we're talking about this, what sorts of AI should we be thinking about? What sorts of AI do you have primarily in mind?
So when talking about open sourcing and model sharing, I've been primarily interested in talking about frontier foundation models. So understanding frontier foundation models as those systems sort of on the cutting edge of development right now. When talking more generally about AI democratization, I tend to think much more broadly. I think a lot of conversation around democratization right now is about frontier AI systems, but it's important to recognize that AI is a very broad category. And well, so is democratization, which is, I'm sure, something we'll talk about.
Okay, cool. So in that case, let's actually just dive into the democratization paper. So this is Democratizing AI, Multiple Meanings, Goals, and Methods by yourself, Aviv Ovadia, Ben Garfinkel, Divya Siddharth, and Alan Defoe. So before I start asking questions, can you give us just a rundown of basically what is this paper?
Yeah, so this paper on AI democratization was born out of an observation around how different actors were using the term AI democratization or democratizing AI, whether we're talking about labs developing AI systems or policymakers or even people in the AI governance space. And there just seemed to be a lot of inconsistency around what this term AI democratization meant. So the paper really started out as just an effort to explain what does it actually mean when someone says democratizing AI. I think there's overlap here with the discussions and debates around open sourcing.
Hmm.
I think there was a lot of, at least for me personally, there was frustration when people would say oh, well, we open source the model and therefore it's democratized. It's like, well, what does that even mean? So the goal of this AI democratization paper was really just to outline the different meanings of AI democratization that were in use. So not necessarily saying how it should be used, but just how is the term being used. And we broke it up into 4 categories. So democratization of AI use is just allowing many more people to interact with and use and benefit from the technology. Then there's the democratization of development, which is allowing many more people to contribute to the development processes and help make the systems really sort of cater to many diverse interests and needs. Democratization of profits, which is about basically distributing the profits that might accrue to labs that are the primary developers and controllers of the technology. And those profits could be massive. And then the democratization of AI governance, which is just involving more people in decision-making processes about AI, about how it's distributed, about how it's developed, about how it's regulated, and about who makes the decisions. And these are all different ways that democratization has been discussed. And then in the paper, we go a step further and say, okay, well, if these are the different kinds of democratization, what are the stated goals of those kinds of democratization? And then what activities help support those goals? And I think the main idea here was to show that oftentimes when people will talk about AI democratization, they're specifically talking about open sourcing or model sharing. And I think one of the main points we try and make is to say that something like, for example, open sourcing AI systems is one form of model sharing. Model sharing is one aspect of democratizing the development of AI systems, and democratizing the development of AI systems is one form of AI democratization. So if you're going to commit to an AI democratization effort or say that these are the goals you have in mind, there's so much more involved in these processes. It's not just about releasing a model, but many more proactive efforts that can go into distributing access to the models, ability to use the models, and to benefit from the models, whether that's through use or through the profits that it produces.
Gotcha. So in the paper, you cite a few examples basically of people using, either talking about something akin to democratization or specifically using the term democratizing AI. And in all the examples you use, it's basically labs talking about it. And it's mostly in a context of we want to democratize AI in the sense of everybody should use our product. It is kind of how I read it. I'm wondering, like, do people other than labs talk about democratizing AI? Like,
Yeah.
is this a thing broadly?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the paper, I think we focused a lot of the lab terminology because, I mean, to be honest, it was written initially as sort of a pushback against
Hmm.
the use of the term by labs to basically say, use our product. And it's like, okay, what does
Yeah.
this actually mean? There's more to it, guys. um, but no. So the term AI democratization, or even just discussing AI democratization, is much more widely engaged with. So one of the co-authors, Divya Siddharth, for example, she and Saffron Huang run the Collective Intelligence Project, and this is a group that focuses largely on democratizing AI governance processes. So getting lots of
Hmm.
people involved in decision making about, for example, AI alignment, or just about different kinds of governance decisions and how that can align with the needs and interests of really diverse populations. So I think there are definitely groups that are sort of popping up and getting really involved in AI democratization from sort of the democratizing governance standpoint. It is a term that's used by labs and not necessarily consistently to just mean use our products. Some of
Hmm.
them mean, like when Stability AI discussed AI democratization and the whole AI for the people, by the people mantra, that was very much about model sharing and making models accessible to lots of people to use as they saw fit. And so, yeah, so you see this in labs, you see this with a lot of groups that are popping up to help democratize governance processes. Probably hear about it less in policy and governance circles, though. Oftentimes, like sometimes I've talked to like union leaders and stuff sometimes, and when they
Hmm.
think about AI democratization, they've spoken about it in sort of like, how are these technologies going to help our workforce, or both in the sense of like making sure that it's like helps the workforce with their needs and helps make their jobs easier, but not necessarily in a way that would threaten jobs, and sort of like, how do we make the integration of the systems into new environments and settings actually work for the people that are using them, and integrating different perspectives in that way. So it's definitely something that I think it's a terminology that's been spreading, and it's part of why we wrote this paper, is trying to understand all the different ways the terminology is being used, though it was largely written in response to the way it was being thrown around by labs and being seen in the media.
Right. That actually gets to something I was thinking. Like, so in this paper, you list these like four definitions, and that sort of inspired me to think like, okay, can I think of like any other things like I might mean by democratizing AI? And one thing that it sounded like these union leaders were talking about is something like how customizable AI is, or how like to what extent can like any person like wield it specifically to do like their own thing rather than just
Mhm.
getting like a one size fits all deal. I'm wondering like I don't know if you have any thoughts about like that at least potential use of the term democratization.
Yeah, so I think that this is something that we've sort of filed under the democratizing use category.
Hmm.
And so one of the things that we tried to do under each of these categories is to show how there wasn't necessarily just one way to democratize use or one way
Right.
to democratize development. So when we talk about democratizing use, one way to do that is just to make a product available, like say, here, use use GPT-4. There you
Yep.
go, it's available, easy access. But other ways to democratize use are, for example, to make the systems more easily accessible by maybe having an interface be more intuitive, like the models, like the API interface, have that be more intuitive, or to provide services to help it be more easily customizable, as you mentioned, to allow people to, whether they're fine tuning it to focus on a particular need, or maybe there are ways through plugins, for example, to integrate it with different services and to different applications, or then even to provide support services to help people integrate your products into downstream applications or into different work streams. Like, these are all different things that can contribute towards democratizing the use of a system. And I think customization is definitely one of those.
Gotcha. So now that we have like a better sense of like, just like what we're talking about in terms of democratization, a question that you address a little bit in the paper, but isn't precisely the front is just like how important is democratization in this context? Because like for most technologies, I don't think a ton about their democratization, right? Like air dehumidifiers or water bottles or something. Like democratization, I don't know, maybe I'm like heartless, but for me, democratization is just like not near the top of the normative priorities for these things. So like, should we even care that much about democratizing AI?
So short answer is yes. I think
Okay.
we should care about democratizing AI. I mean, you make a good point. Like we don't talk about democratizing air humidifiers or water bottles. But I think this is a question that comes up when talking about AI a lot. Is just how is it different from other technologies? And this
Hmm.
is a question that's been asked. Whether you're talking about how it's shared or in this context how it's democratized, and specifically with regard to the discussion on democratization, making something available for more people to use, available for more people to benefit from or contribute to the design processes. I think this is particularly important in the case of AI, because if AI promises to be as transformative a technology as we're hoping it to be,
Hmm.
this will massively impact lives of across the globe, from different groups, different nationalities, different geographic settings, and so making sure that we can have input from different groups into design processes, into understanding what needs are best served, that's going to be important to make sure that this technology doesn't just serve a few very well, but serves many people and benefits the world as a whole. I think this is also particularly important to note with regard to the democratization of profits. AI is already, but may continue to be just like an insanely financially lucrative industry. And we could begin to see the accrual of profits to leading labs on huge scales, where we might see a particular company, for example, have be able to measure its gross income in terms of like total percentages of total world output or something like those. That is huge economic profit,
Hmm.
and and we want a way to make sure that ideally everyone benefits from this. It doesn't just pile up in a few companies in a few geographic locations like Silicon Valley. um, how do we how do we make sure that this is well distributed? And there are some direct methods that can be employed. So, like in the section in the paper where we talk about democratizing profits, some of the things that we discuss are like, you could have adherence to like windfall clauses. This would be something where, let's say, a company has some kind of windfall profit, like measured in terms of percentage of gross world output. In that case, there might be a commitment to redistribute some of those funds. Or we might see like taxation and redistribution schemes, but there are also more indirect ways as well that you can think about distributing profits. This would be, for example, are there ways that we can get more people involved in democratization of development? So more people involved in developing products. So there's kind of overlap between democratizing profits, democratizing development.
Hmm.
More people can contribute to development of products, then this might challenge a natural monopoly that might otherwise form around large labs. More competition, more distribution of profits, more people in on the game. So yeah, I think what it comes down to is like, if this technology can be as big and as transformative as it promises to be, having more people involved in the development process and being able to benefit from the value that's produced by these systems is really important.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Actually, that reminds me of so as you mentioned, there's some link between democratizing, I guess, the development of AI and the profits, in the sense that like if more
Mhm.
people make AI products, that means more people can profit from them, presumably. Um, there's also, to my mind, there's sort of a continuum between like the use of AI and the development of AI, right? Like,
Mhm.
you could use a thing, like in some sense, when you use a thing for a task, you're sort of developing a way of using it for that task, right? There's sort
Yeah.
of a fuzzy line there. And there's also some sort of link between developing AI and governing AI, right? Just in the sense that,
Mhm.
like, if I develop some AI product, I'm now de facto the main person governing how it
Yeah,
is made and how
which
it is.
which is sort of what we're seeing right now. Like a lot of the AI governance discussion is around the fact that major AI labs are making huge, impactful decisions about the future of AI. Like they're making AI
Hmm.
governance decisions, and there's a big open question of who should actually be making these questions. Should it just be a few unelected tech leaders of major companies, or should this be distributed more? So yeah, there's definitely overlap between the categories.
Yeah. So I take the point of your paper to be saying like, oh, these are like very distinct, like these are conceptually pretty distinct, and like you can promote one sort of democratization without promoting other sorts of democratization. But to the degree that like they do seem to have these links and overlaps, like is it maybe a case of just a rising tide lifts all boats, and like you know by one kind of
Um,
democratization get the others free?
I think kind of, maybe, sort of, not really.
Okay.
All of the above. No, so there definitely is overlap between some of the categories, and I think it's either in this paper or maybe in the blog post version. I think we say, like, these are not perfectly distinct categories. There's going to be
Yep.
overlap between them. I think part of the utility of breaking it up into the categories is to point out that there are lots of different meanings. There are lots of ways to achieve these different meanings and goals. It's not just about, like, just open sourcing a model or just making it available for people to use. There's a lot more
Hmm.
to it. And so I think in some respects, there is sort of a rising tide lifts all boats kind of thing. Like you said, you might get more people involved in development processes. And if more people are developing AI systems, more people profit from it. And that can help distribute profits. But on the other hand, you can also see direct conflicts between categories sometimes. So, for example, you might, I think this is something we write about in the paper, is talking about democratizing governance. So decisions about AI, whether that's about how AI is developed or even how decisions are made about how models are shared. These days, there's a really heated debate around open sourcing frontier AI models, and let's say you democratize this decision making process around whether or not certain models should be released open source, and let's say the outcome of this democratized decision making process is to say, okay, maybe some models that pose substantially high risks should not be released open source. This is a hypothetical, but let's say that's the outcome of a deliberative democratic process and decision making that could be in direct conflict with the interests of democratizing development, where democratizing development, that is always furthered by providing better access to models. So you could
Hmm.
have a case in which you've democratized a governance decision, but the outcome of that governance decision is to impede some other form of democratization. I mean, not just with development. I mean, I guess you could have a democratic process that says, I don't know, like, large companies should not be taxed and have profits redistributed. I mean, that would be in direct conflict with an effort to democratize profits. So there
Hmm.
could be conflicts. I think it's usually between the governance category and the other categories. I mean, I guess governance often will conflict with specific goals. That's kind of the purpose, is to temper decision making and make it more. I guess, yeah, you get more people involved in the decision making processes, and make sure that those decisions are democratically legitimate and reflect the needs and interests of a wider population of impacted people and stakeholders.
Okay. Yeah. So this actually brings up a question I had about the interaction between like democratizing use slash development and democratizing governance. So like in the paper, yeah, as you mentioned, I guess the main interaction you draw out is this tension, right, between like democratizing use, like it's potentially not necessarily what a democratic process would produce on the governance side.
Mhm.
But so when I think about like since I don't know, about a year ago, we've had like ChatGPT, which in some sense like really democratized the I guess the use of large language models in the sense that it's like
Mhm.
relatively cheap to I don't know, maybe free to use these things. And so I don't know, one effect is that like, now it is impossible to at least have banned ChatGPT a year ago or something. But to my mind, a big effect of this is something like increasing people's knowledge of like where AI is at, what kinds of things that language models can do, and essentially like I don't know if this is a term, but like you can think of people as having like governance demands, right? Like
Mhm.
if I know more about a technology, I might say like, oh, this is like totally fine, or oh, we need to like do this thing or that thing about it. And if people like know more about a technology, they can have they can basically have a better sense of what they want their governance demands to be. And so, in that sense, it seems like there's this positive, at least to some degree, there can be a positive interaction between democratizing use and democratizing governance.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. I mean, this is sort of a classic pillar of democracy, is the having the informed public, right? You need to have the information to be able to do the good decision making about the object of your decision making. So, yeah, so I think like release of ChatGPT, for example, really put put AI on the public stage, suddenly I have
Hmm.
my like my mom and dad texting me, asking me questions about AI, and that never would have happened a year ago.
Hmm.
And yeah, so I think it put the technology on the stage. It's got more people involved in it. I think more people have a general sense of at least what current capabilities are able to do and of the limitations. And that's all been very valuable for sort of enabling more democratic decision making processes about AI. And so there's definitely that link between, you democratize use, you democratize development, people understand the technology better, they'll be able to make more well-informed decisions or form more well-informed opinions about how the technology should be regulated. So I think, no, I think that that's not necessarily intention. I guess the intention tends to go the other directions, like if a governance decision perhaps would say like, oh, this particular technology is too dangerous, or releasing this particular model is just, that surpasses an acceptable risk threshold. I guess if you took a strict definition of democratizing development as meaning like
Hmm.
always spreading the technology further, always getting more people involved in a development process, always making a system accessible, then yeah, a decision to restrict access would be in direct conflict with democratizing development. But I think this is another thing we try and say in the paper is like trying to get away from this idea that AI democratization is inherently good.
Hmm.
I think this is a problem with actually kind of like a problem with the term democratization is, especially in like Western democratic societies, oftentimes democracy is used as a stand-in for all things good. So you get companies saying, "Oh, we're democratizing AI." Like it almost doesn't even matter what that means. They've democracy washed their products now.
Hmm.
It looks like a good thing. And so I think that was one thing we were trying to get across in the paper is, yeah, AI democratization is not necessarily a good thing. Spreading a technology for more people to contribute to a development process or for more people to use is only good if that's actually going to benefit people. But if it poses significant risk or is going to put a lot of people in harm's way, then that's not inherently positive. So I guess one thing to say is just, if all that's meant when people say AI democratization or democratize AI is just make the system more accessible, then
Hmm.
just say make the system more accessible. Because I think that's very clear what it means, and it's not inherently good or bad. I mean, I don't know if we're going to successfully change everyone's terminology in the course of one podcast, but
Well, we can try.
we can try. But I think that's maybe one key takeaway from the paper as well. If people say they're engaging in an effort to democratize AI, that does not necessarily mean it's going to be a net beneficial effort.
Gotcha. So, I guess I'd like to talk a bit about the individual senses. In particular, I guess I want to start off with when you talk about democratizing profits. So, one thing I noticed is I think there's one or two quotes you use in this section, and I think the quotes actually say something like we want to make sure that not all the value created by AI
Mm.
stays in one place, or that the benefits of AI don't just accrue to like a small group of people. And like in those quotes, they don't actually use the term profit, right? Like, and in some ways, you can imagine that like these could go different ways, right? For instance, take GitHub Copilot, right? It costs like I guess $100 a year. Suppose that like everyone in the world just like pays $100 a year and it all goes to GitHub, but like tons of people use GitHub Copilot to do incredibly useful things, and
Hmm.
they like get a bunch of value and benefits out of it that may or may not be you know probably most of the benefits will be financial, but not all of them will be. So that seems to me like it would be a case of spreading the value or benefits of AI, but it's not necessarily a
Hmm.
case of spreading the profit from AI.
Yeah. No, I
So
mean it was so yeah, the profits category is kind of it was an odd category. Actually, in the process of writing this paper, unlike most papers, we actually wrote the blog post first and then wrote the
uh-huh.
paper, as opposed to going the other direction. And in the blog post, which is on GovAI's website, it actually breaks into four categories: democratization of use, democratization of development, democratization of benefits, and
Hmm.
democratization of governance. And for the version in the paper, we chose the profits terminology instead of benefits terminology because benefits was in a way like it was too broad. um,
Hmm.
because I think there was just, I mean, you've already pointed this out, like there's a lot of overlap between these categories. And
Yep.
like one reason to democratize development, for example, is to make sure that more people can benefit from the technology, that it serves their need. A reason to democratize use is to ensure that more people can access and use and even use the systems to produce value and profit. If you can integrate it with your own businesses and with your own applications, you can develop value on it from your side. So I think we chose this democratization of profits terminology just to point out that there is a discussion around just like the massive accrual of profits to large tech companies.
Hmm.
I think, yeah, you do point out like some of the quotes that we use talk a little bit more broadly about accrual of value. I think sometimes it's hard to measure profits just in terms of like the literal money that drops into someone's bank account.
Okay.
So yeah, so I think it's hard to find exact quotes from companies. I know that there's been a lot of discussion, not by companies, but actually this is one thing that you will hear policymakers talk about more. This was part of when universal basic income was something that was being discussed a lot. It had its moment when people were
Oh
talking
yeah.
about it a lot more. A lot of the discussion around universal basic income was around, well, it was around job loss caused by automation, but
Hmm.
also around the accrual of profits to tech companies and to developers of these new technologies. And okay, if all the profits are going to shift from the workforce to the developers of these technologies, how are we going to redistribute it out? So that's actually one context in which like democratization of profits was directly linked to the discussion around AI development.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think maybe some of the quotes we used in the paper do more vaguely gesture to just value. But
Yeah.
yeah, but we separated profits out just because the way we had it in the blog post was just a bit, it was a bit too general. There was too much overlap. We were kind of double dipping, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think it was just to illustrate that there is this discussion specifically about profits, but I don't think. I mean, it's definitely not the most commonly used. If you heard someone talking about AI democratization just walking down the street, you wouldn't immediately think, oh, they must be talking about profit redistribution. Like that's not where your brain goes. It's just,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it is one aspect worth noting, I think is the main takeaway.
Fair enough. Yeah. The next one I want to talk a bit more about is, I guess, democratizing AI governance. So, I guess related to the thing you just said, it seems to me that if somebody talks about democratizing I think it's pretty unlikely that they, like, if they just say democratizing AI, they mean democratizing governance. I'm wondering if that matches with your experience.
So, yes and no.
Okay.
I think oftentimes when you see in media or you're listening to tech companies and the dialogue that they're having, yeah, very rarely will it talk about democratizing governance. I think we are starting to see a shift though. For example, with like OpenAI had this AI democratization grant program. I can't
Hmm.
remember exactly what it's called right now, but basically they're putting out grants to research groups to study methods for basically trying to bring in input from more diverse communities to try and better understand what values systems should align to. And so, in that sense, you're kind of talking about AI democratization in this more participatory, deliberative process of bringing people into decision making processes to define principles or define values for AI alignment. So OpenAI had that grant program. I think Anthropic just put out a blog post where they'd worked closely with the Collective Intelligence Project that I mentioned earlier, doing a similar thing for developing their constitutional AI, defining what the constitutional principles are that AI systems should be aligned to, and that was more of a democratic governance process.
Hmm.
So I think we're starting to see this terminology of AI democratization, democratizing AI, seep into the technical landscape a bit more, and I think that's a very positive thing. I think it's kind of showing that like they're starting to tap into and really embody the democratic principles of democratizing AI as opposed to just meaning distribution and access. It actually means reflecting and representing the interests and values of stakeholders and impacted populations. So I think we are starting to see that shift, but I think you're probably right in that mostly, again, like in the walking down the
Hmm.
street, you hear someone talking about AI democratization, probably just talking about distribution of a technology, making it more accessible. That's sort of the classic terminology. But I do think that in sort of the AI governance space and even in the terminology being used by labs, we're starting to see the governance meaning seep in, and that's exciting.
Gotcha. So getting to the question about whether this is good, I think in the paper you say something like, the notion of democratization of use, benefits, use, development, and profit. I think you say something like those ones aren't inherently good, and they get their normative force from democratization, basically in terms of the governance
Mhm,
method.
mhm,
So I guess first of all, like that wasn't actually so obvious to me. So I think like I think sometimes democratization, I think it often carries this implicit sense of like being more related to egalitarianism
mhm.
than like democracy as a political decision making method.
Yeah.
So, and I think like you can have egalitarianism without democratic decision making, and you can have democratic decision making without egalitarianism, right? Like
Mhm.
people can vote away minorities' rights or whatever. So, yeah, I was wondering, like, yeah, why do you say, or okay, I guess what I actually mean is, please defend your claim that that's the source of like the goodness of democracy or of democratization is a word.
Yeah, so, okay, so a couple things, 3 things, maybe 2 things. We'll see how it comes out.
All right.
So to start out with, I do stand by the idea that, like, the first 3 forms of democratization, so development, use, profits,
Hmm.
not necessarily inherently good, not not inherently bad, just these are things that happen, and if we
Yep.
stick by their definitions of, like, it just means making something more accessible, whether that's access for use or development or making the profits more accessible. Access is not inherently good or bad. Again, if we use the, like, access for development example,
Yep.
if you have a technology that's going to be potentially really dangerous, you don't necessarily want everyone to have access to that. And a
Hmm.
democratic decision making process might result in the conclusion that indeed not everyone should have access to it. So that's the first part, is like standing by that first half of the claim.
Sure.
The second part around the thing that gives it the moral force or value is the democratic decision making process that was involved. I don't know if that's exactly what we're going for in the paper. I think there are lots of different methods that you can use to help reflect and serve the interests of wider populations. And I think, for some technologies, like let's go back to your water bottle example. We don't need a panel of people from around the globe to tell us how to distribute water bottles. Like it's this is a decision that probably water bottle distributors can be like, let's just sell our water bottles to as many people as possible, and
Yep.
probably fine. I think it comes to like where the impact's going to be, how big the impact's going to be. Are there areas where it, like, the negative impacts of a technology might be more disproportionately felt? And in those cases, being able to bring those voices in to inform decision making processes that might affect them disproportionately is really important.
Hmm.
Yeah. And I know we give examples in the paper of like different kinds of democratic processes that can be used to inform decision making, whether these are participatory processes or more deliberative democratic processes. So, like in the open source paper we just released, we talk about some of these processes as ways of making more democratic decisions around AI, but
Hmm.
then also point to like one way to democratize governance decisions is to support regulation that is put forth by democratic governance, and that those governments, hopefully, if structured well, reflect and serve the interests of the constituents. And hopefully, some of those governance processes are actually formed by having maybe some sort of deliberative process that takes into account stakeholder interests and the interests of impacted populations. But it's not like the only way to govern AI is to say like, okay, let's have a participatory panel
Hmm.
where we take in all this insight and then use it to inform every decision. Because I think you're right. Like, you want that would just be completely impractical to
Hmm.
have like every decision that a lab makes be informed by a participatory panel or some sort of deliberative democratic process. So I mean, you kind of have to range it depending on the potential impact of the question. So I don't know
Sure.
if that answers your question completely,
Yeah.
but I guess it's like, stand by the first point that like democratization not inherently good.
Yeah.
The extent of the goodness, I guess, reflects how well the decisions reflect and serve the interests of the people that are going to be impacted. And then there are lots of different ways of figuring out how to do that.
Okay. That makes sense. So I guess the second thing I want to ask about that sentence is like when you say that the democratization of use development of benefits is not inherently good, like it kind of makes it sound like you think that democratization of governance is inherently good. So I found this paper that you actually cite. It's called "Against Democratizing AI" by Himmelreich,
Okay.
written in 2023, published in 2023. So he basically makes a few critiques. Firstly, like he just says that AI isn't the sort of thing that needs to be democratic. Like AI in itself doesn't affect a bunch of people. There are just organizations that
Mhm.
use AI and they affect a bunch of people, and maybe they should be democratized, but AI itself doesn't have to be. He says that like the relevant institutions, like the relevant things, are already democratic. Democracy is like pretty resource intensive. People have to know a
Yeah.
bunch of stuff. You have to take a bunch of votes and things. And he also has complaints that like democracy is imperfect and doesn't necessarily fix oppression. So there are a few complaints about like democratizing AI floating around. So, and I guess in this case, he's talking about democratizing AI governance.
Yeah.
Is it the case that democratizing AI governance is inherently good?
I don't think so. Again, I think it comes back to this the ranging it question. What
Right.
are we talking like? First of all, like the resource intensive point, absolutely. It can be incredibly resource intensive to do like an in-depth participatory governance process. This is why you don't do it for every single question that's out there. Like, yeah, so that's like really good point. There's also the point of like, you need to be well informed to make good decisions. So maybe we don't want the general public making decisions about like all questions around AI. Like, I
Hmm.
mean, experts are having a hard enough time for themselves trying to decide what constitutes like a high risk system. Like we're not even good at benchmarking this among the community of AI experts. How are you going to sort of tap into more like general public notions of what a high risk system is, or like what proper benchmarking should look like? So there's some questions where it just doesn't make sense to democratize it. So I think you have to think about like what questions are there, is it like realistic to have more democratized discussions around? So like maybe something like thinking about what acceptable risk thresholds are, or like what kind of values to align to. And I think it's also important to remember there are lots of different kinds of democratic processes. When we talk about democratic
Hmm.
processes, it's not necessarily what you might think of as like we all go to the polls and cast our ballot on, do we want A or do we want B? These could be more deliberative processes where you just get, some stakeholders in a room, they have discussion, they try and figure out what are the main issues, these discussions. So there are processes in place to hold like deliberative democratic processes that are informed, like you have experts come in and try and inform the discussion. So this would be a more informed deliberative process. One way is, sometimes when it comes to, I don't know, like with image generation systems, there was a whole bunch of discussion around bias in images. And, part of this is just getting people. This is, again, we see overlap between governance and other kinds of categories. If you get more people involved using the systems and they start understanding where the biases are, that is a form of education. Having more familiarity, and then if you can raise these complaints, whether that's, directly to the companies or maybe through some sort of like political intermediary. I remember there being a statement released by Anna Eshoo, who I think was the congressional representative in, I want to say, South San Jose,
Okay.
that talked in quite a bit of depth about, it was right after the release of Stable Diffusion, and talking about how there was like a lot of racial bias in some of the images that were being produced, specifically against Asian women. And like, so this is something that was raised up like through a democratic process, was brought to the attention of the congressional office, and then the statement was released, and then that had knock-on effects on like future governance decisions and decision making by labs to do things like put safety filters. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind, is like there's a wide range of things that you can think about in terms of like what it means to democratize a governance project process.
Okay.
So like governance is just decision making, and then how do you make sure those decision making processes reflect the interests of the people who are going to be impacted? It's not just about direct participation, although there is a lot of work being done to bring more direct participatory methods into even the more small scale decision making, to make it more realistic. Like this complaint about it being so resource intensive, that's
Hmm.
true. We also have technologies available to help make it less resource intensive. And how can we tap into those to actually help like a public input to these decisions in a well informed way?
Hmm.
Yeah, so there's lots of interesting work going on. I don't think it's inherent, like democratic governance isn't inherently good when it
Okay.
comes to AI governance. I think again it depends on the question. If the cost of doing a full-blown democratic process is going to far outstrip the benefit of doing a full-blown democratic process, then there'd be a situation in which it's probably not a net benefit to do a democratic decision-making process.
Yeah. So that gets to Hilmreich's resource intensive complaint. He also has these complaints that like basically AI itself is not the kind of thing that needs to be democratically governed. So he says something like, I'll see if I can remember, but like the kind of thing that needs to be democratically governed is like maybe something that like just impinges on people's lives whether they like it or not, or something that's like just inherent to large scale cooperation or something like that. And he basically makes this claim that like, look, AI doesn't do those things. Like AI is housed in institutions that do those things, right? So if you're worried about like, I don't know, maybe the police using facial recognition or something, like you should worry about democratic accountability of police, not facial recognition,
Mhm.
is the point I take him to be making. So firstly, he says like, look, we don't need to democratize AI. We need to democratize things that potentially use AI. And secondly, it seems like he's saying like the relevant things that would be using AI, they're like already democratic. So like we shouldn't sort of have conflicting like I think he talks about democratic overlap or something where like they're I think he really doesn't like the idea of these like different democratic institutions like trying to
Yeah.
affect the same decision and maybe they conflict or something.
Yeah, so I think I don't disagree.
Okay.
um, so I think this idea of like the if I understood correctly, this idea of like, you don't need to democratize the AI, you need to democratize the institution that's using it. I think that's a
Yep.
completely valid point. Like these are not like AI itself again, it's not inherently bad or good. It's a dual use technology. It depends what you're going to do with the thing. But I would say that, trying to decide, for example, how law enforcement should use AI systems, that is an AI governance question. This
Okay.
is a question about how AI is being used, about how AI is being regulated. In this context, not in terms of how it's being developed, but in context of how it's being used. What are the appropriate use cases of AI? This is an AI governance question. And it's not necessarily that like these are regulations that are placed on AI specifically. A lot of AI regulation really it just like already exists within different institutions. It's just figuring out how to have that regulation apply to AI systems. This might be cases like if you have requirements for like certain health and safety standards that have to be met by
Hmm.
by certain technology in a work setting. AI shouldn't be held to different standards. It's just a matter of figuring out how to measure and make sure that those standards are met by the AI system. So like these are, yeah. So I guess based on what you said, I want to say that I completely agree,
Okay.
but I would say that it still falls under the umbrella of democratizing AI governance. I think that what might be
Yeah.
happening here is just like another conflict over like what does the terminology mean? Where it's like we don't need
Hmm.
to democratize AI as in we don't need to get more people directly involved in the development and decision making about individual decisions around AI development. In which case, like, yes, I agree. but we might be talking about democratizing AI governance and different. This is why these discussions get really complicated because we just end up
Hmm.
talking past each other because we use the same word to mean five different things.
Yeah. Yeah, it can be rough. So before we close up our discussion on democratizing AI, I'm wondering, I don't know, I guess you've thought about democratizing AI for a while. Do you have any favorite interventions to make AI more democratic or to make AI less democratic in any of the relevant senses?
I'll be completely honest. This is sort of where my expertise drops off
Okay.
in terms of like the more nitty gritty of like what processes are available and exactly when are certain processes the best ones to be applied. For this, I would really look more closely at like the work that the Collective Intelligence Project's doing, or my co-author Aviva Vedya, who's on the paper. He's really involved with these discussions and works with various labs to help implement different democratic processes. Yeah, I was just going to say this is where my expertise drops off, and I would point towards my colleagues for more in-depth discussion on that work.
All right. The next thing I want to talk about is basically open sourcing AI. So there's this report, open sourcing highly capable foundation models, an evaluation of risks, benefits, and alternative methods for pursuing open source objectives. It's by yourself and a bunch of other co-authors, but mostly, as far as I could see, at the Center for the Governance of AI.
Mhm.
And again, could you perhaps give an overview of what's going on in this report?
Okay, yeah. So this report's a little harder to give an overview on because unlike the democratization paper, which is like 8 pages, this one's about 60 pages.
Yep.
But yeah, I'd say so. Quick overview. First thing is that we wanted to point out that there's a debate right now around whether or not large foundation models, especially frontier foundation models, should be open sourced. This is a debate that has kicked off, I mean, starting with Stability AI's release of Stable Diffusion, and then there was the Llama 2 release, and then the weights were leaked, and now Meta's kind of getting behind this open source thing. There were the protests outside of Meta about whether or not systems should be open source, and then we're also seeing a lot of activity with the development of the EU AI Act. And as part of the EU AI Act, there's some parties are pushing for an exemption of regulation for groups that produce that develop open source models. So a lot of discussion around open source, and I think the goal of this paper was to cut through what is becoming a quickly polarized debate. We're finding that you have people that are, see the benefits of open sourcing and are just like very, very hardcore pro open source, and then won't really hear any of the arguments around the potential dangers. And then you have people who are very anti open source, only want to talk about the dangers and sort of refuse to see the benefits. And it just makes it really hard to have any kind of like coherent dialogue around this question. Yet at the same time, governments are trying to make very real policy around model sharing.
Hmm.
So how can we cut through this polarized debate to just try and say here's the lay of the land? So what we're trying to do in this paper is really provide a well balanced, well researched overview of both the risks and benefits of open sourcing highly capable models. By highly capable models, we basically what we're talking about is frontier AI systems. We just don't use the term frontier because the frontier moves, but
Yeah.
we want to be clear that there will be some systems that might be highly capable enough and pose risks that are high enough that even if they aren't on the frontier, we should still be careful about open sourcing them. So basically, we're talking about frontier models, but frontier keeps going. So
Yeah.
we wanted to be clear. So we can get into the terminology debate a little bit more later. But basically, we wanted to outline what are the risks and benefits of open sourcing these increasingly highly capable models, but then not just to have like yet another piece that says, well, here are the risks and here are the benefits, but to then kind of cut through by saying, maybe there are also alternative ways that we can try to achieve some of the same benefits of open sourcing, but at less risk. So the idea here is actually quite similarly to the democratization paper, is to not just say like what is open sourcing and is it good or bad, but to say what are the specific goals of open sourcing? Why do people say that open sourcing is good, that it's something we should be doing, that should be defended, that should be preserved? So why is it we want to be open source AI models? And then if we can be specific about why we want to open source, are there other methods that we can employ to try to achieve some of these same goals at less risk? Or and these might be other model sharing methods, like releasing a model behind API or doing a staged release, or it might be other more proactive measures. Like, let's say one benefit of open sourcing is that it can help accelerate research progress, both in developing more greater AI capabilities, but also promoting AI safety research. Like another way you can promote AI safety research is to dedicate a certain percentage of profits towards AI safety research, or to have research collaborations. And you can do these things without necessarily having to provide access for anybody to have access to the model. So this is what we were trying to do with this paper, is really just say like, okay, we're going to give, first of all, just a very well-researched overview of both the risks and benefits. In fact, majority of the paper actually focuses on what are the benefits and trying to break down the benefits of open sourcing, and then really doing a deep dive into alternative methods or other things that can be done to help pursue these benefits where the risks might just be too high. And I think that the main claim that we do make in the paper with regard to like, is open sourcing good or bad? First of all, it's a false dichotomy.
Yep.
But I think our main statement is like open sourcing is overwhelmingly good. Open sourcing is like open source development of software. Open source software underpins all of the technology we're using today. This like it's huge. It's hugely important. It's been great for technological development, for the development of safe technology that reflects lots of different user needs and interests. Great stuff. The issue is that there might be some cutting edge, highly capable AI systems that pose risks of malicious use or the proliferation of dangerous capabilities, or even proliferation of harms and vulnerabilities to downstream applications. And where these risks are extreme enough, we need to take a step back and say, maybe we should have some processes in place to decide whether or not open sourcing these systems is okay. So I think the main thrust of the report is open sourcing is overarching good. There just may be cases in which it's not the best decision, and we need to be careful in those cases. So yeah, I think that's like the main overview of the paper.
Gotcha. And yeah, in case listeners were put off by the 60-something pages, I want listeners to know there is an executive summary.
Yes,
It's pretty
there's a
readable.
2-page executive summary.
Yeah.
Don't worry.
Yeah, I read the paper and I vouch for the executive summary being a fair summary of it. So don't be intimidated, listeners.
I've also been putting off writing the blog post, so there will be a blog post version at some point.
Okay.
I promise.
Yeah, so it's possible that that might be done by the time we release this, in which case we'll link the blog post.
Or maybe by Christmas.
Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully you'll have a Christmas gift, listeners. So when we're talking about these like highly capable foundation models, and basically about the risks of open sourcing them. As I guess we've already gotten into, like, what is a highly capable foundation model is like a little bit unclear.
Yeah,
Maybe it would
difficult.
be easier to say, like, what kinds of risks are we talking about? Because I think like once we know the kinds of risks, we know what sorts of things we should be willing to do to avert those risks, or just what we should be thinking of, and B, we can just say, okay, we're just worried about AIs that could potentially cause those risks. So
yeah,
what are the risks?
So I think in fact, I think framing it in terms of risks is really helpful. So generally here we're thinking about risks of significant harm, significant societal or even physical harm, or even economic harm. But and of course now you say, oh, define significant. But basically just more catastrophic, extreme, significant societal risks, harm. So we use some examples in the paper, like looking at potential for malicious use. There are some more diffuse harms, like if you're thinking about political influence operations. So this kind of falls into the misinformation, disinformation discussion. How might AI systems be used to basically influence political campaigns? So disinformation, undermine trust in political leaders, and then in turn, like if you can disrupt information ecosystems and disintegrate the processes by which we exchange information, or even just disintegrate trust in key information sources enough, that can also impact our ability as a society to respond to things like crises. So I mean, kind of like pandemic is a good example of like if it's really hard to get people accurate information about, for example, whether or not mask wearing is effective, you're not going to have really good coordinated decision making around mask wearing.
Yep.
So I think this is one where it's just like it's a little bit more diffuse. It's harder to measure. So I think this is one point where it's quite difficult to sort of identify when the harm is happening because it's so diffuse. But I think like this is one potential significant harm. I'd say maybe thinking about like maybe disrupting major political elections or something like that. There's some options for malicious use that are talked about a little more frequently, I think, because they're more well defined and sort of easier to wrap your head around. These are things like using generative AI to produce biological weapons or toxins, even production of malware to mount cyber attacks against key critical infrastructure. Like imagine taking down an electrical grid, or imagine like on election day taking down an electoral system. These could have like significant societal impacts in terms of like harm to society or physical harm. And I think one key thing to point out here is that we aren't necessarily seeing these capabilities already. I mean, some people may disagree, but I think my opinion is that technologies with the potential for this kind of harm do not currently exist. I think it is wise to assume that they will come into existence in the not too distant future, largely because we're seeing indications of these kinds of capabilities developing. Like we've already seen how even narrow AI systems that are used in drug discovery, if you flip that parameter that's supposed to optimize for non-toxicity to optimize for toxicity, now you have a toxin generator. And so it's like it doesn't take a huge stretch of the imagination to see how more capable systems could be used to cause quite significant societal harm. So no, I don't think there's currently systems that do this. I think we need to be prepared for a future in which these systems do exist. So it's worth thinking about the wisdom of releasing these systems now, even if we might not be present with the technology at this moment.
Okay. So as a follow-up question, so you're currently on the AI X Risk Research podcast. I'm wondering, is so it seems like you're mostly thinking of things less severe than all humans dying or just permanently stunting the human trajectory.
I mean, I wouldn't say necessarily. Like, I
Okay.
think this is definitely a possibility. I think part of what's happening is like you kind of have to range how you talk about these things. Like
Hmm.
I am concerned about X risk from AI. And I think, we could have systems where whether it's the cyber capability or the biological terror capability or even the taking down political systems capability and authoritarian like bolstering authoritarian governments, like these are things that could cause existential risk. And I am personally worried about this.
Okay.
But, trying to write papers that are digestible to a much wider population who might not be totally bought into the X risk arguments. I think there are still, X risk aside,
Yep.
there are still very genuine arguments for not necessarily releasing a model because of the harm that it can cause. Even if you don't think that those are existential risks, like even if
Okay.
it's just catastrophic harm, probably still not a great idea.
Okay. So at the very least, there's a range going on there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one question I had in my mind, especially when thinking about or thinking about AI that can cause these kinds of risks and potentially open sourcing it, and part of me is thinking it seems like a lot of basically the risks of open sourcing seem to be, well, there's now more people who can use this AI system to do a bunch of harm,
Hmm.
and the harm is just so great that that's really scary and dangerous. So one thing I was wondering is if it's so dangerous for many people to have this AI technology, is it not also dangerous for anybody at all to have this AI technology, right? It how big is this zone where it makes sense to make the AI but not to open source it? Or does this zone even exist?
Yeah. No, so I mean, you make a very genuine point, and there are those that would argue that we should just hit the big old red stop button right now.
Hmm.
you know, and I think like that is an argument some people make. I guess where we're coming from in with respect to this paper is trying to be realistic about how AI development is probably going to happen and try to inform governance decisions around what we should do as AI development continues.
Hmm.
I think there are differing opinions on this, probably even among the authors on the paper. I mean, there's what 20, 25, 20, 26 authors on
Yeah,
the paper.
the paper
Um,
has a disclaimer, listeners, that not all authors necessarily endorse every claim in the paper.
that includes me.
Okay.
But it's like, yeah, so we have a very, very broad group of authors. But I think, oh, I was trying to, forgetting what was your original question? It just flew out of my head.
If it's too dangerous to open source, is it also
Yes.
too dangerous to make?
Yeah. No, so I think there's definitely an argument for this. I guess where I'm coming from is trying to be realistic about where this development process is going and how to inform governments on what to do as AI development continues. I mean, it may very well be the case that we get to a point where everyone's convinced that we just, have a big coordinated pause slash stop in AI development. But assuming that that's not possible
Hmm.
or improbable, shall we say, I think it's still wise to have a contingency plan. How can we guide AI development to be safe and largely beneficial and reduce the potential for risk? I think there's also an argument to be made that increasingly capable systems, while they pose increasingly severe risks, also could provide increasingly great benefits and potential economic potential benefits for helping to solve other challenges and crises that we face. Yeah, so I think you'd be hard pressed to get a giant coordinated pause. So the next plan is how do we make AI development happen safely? And it is a lot easier to keep people safe if the super dangerous ones are not spread widely. I guess that's that's the very simplistic view. Um, yeah, so I think at least for me, I think it just comes from a realism about are we likely to pause AI development before it gets super scary? probably not, just given how humanity works. And like, we developed nuclear weapons, probably shouldn't have done that. Oops, well, now they exist. Let's deal with it. So I think having a similar plan in line for what do we do with increasingly capable AI systems is important, especially given that it might not be that far away.
Hmm.
Like I said, we're it's just sort of like with each new generation of AI that's released, we all kind of hold our breaths and say, "Oh, well, what's that one going to do?" And then we learn from it. And we don't know what the next generation of AI system is going to bring. And so having systems in place to scan for potential harms, potential dangers, capabilities, to inform decisions about whether or not these systems should be released and if and how they should be shared, that's really important. We might not be able to coordinate a pause before the big scary happens.
Hmm.
And yeah, so I think it's important to discuss this regardless.
Gotcha.
That's a technical term, by the way, the big
Yeah.
scary.
Makes sense. So, yeah, speaking of the risks of open sourcing AI, so in the paper, you kind of talk about the offense defense balance.
Yes.
And basically, you say that, like, bad actors, they can disable, misuse safeguards, they can introduce new dangerous capabilities by fine tuning, like, open sourcing makes this easier, it increases attacker knowledge. And in terms of, like, just the AI technology, you basically make a claim that it's tilted towards offense, in that attackers can do they get more knowledge, they can disable safeguards, they can introduce new dangerous capabilities. It's easier to find these problems than it is to fix them, and once you fix them, it's hard to make sure that everyone has the fixes. Is that like a fair? Would you say that's a fair summary of like?
Yeah, I'd say that's pretty fair. I think the one thing I'd add, yeah, I'd say that with software development, for example, so like offense defense balance is something that's often discussed in terms of open sourcing and scientific publication,
Hmm,
especially anytime you have dual use technology or scientific insights that could be used to cause harm. You kind of have to address this offense defense balance. Is the information that's going to be released going to help the bad actors do the bad things more or less than it's going to help the good actors do the good things slash
yeah.
prevent the bad actors from doing the bad things? And I think with software development, it's often in favor of defense, in finding holes and fixing bugs and rolling out the fixes and making the technology better, safer, more robust. And these are genuine arguments in favor of like why open sourcing AI systems is valuable as well. But I think especially with larger, more complex models, we start veering towards offense balance. And I think I just want to emphasize, I think one of the main reasons for this has to do with how difficult the fixes are. So in the case of software, you get bugs that are and vulnerabilities that are relatively well defined. Once you find them, relatively
Hmm,
easy to fix, roll out the fix. The safety challenges that we're facing with highly capable AI systems are quite complex. We have huge research teams around the world trying to figure them out. And it takes, it's a very resource intensive process, takes a lot of talent. Vulnerabilities are still easy to find. we just well, they're just a lot harder to fix. So I think this is a main reason why the offense defense balance probably skews more towards offense
hmm.
and enabling malicious actors, because you still find the vulnerabilities, you can still manipulate the vulnerabilities, take advantage of them. Harder to fix even if you have more people involved. So that's, yeah, the high level evaluation, mostly right. I just wanted to push on the safety issue a little harder.
Gotcha. Yeah, I wonder. So, yeah, one thing this actually brings up for me is you may or may not be familiar. So there's AI that plays the board game Go.
Yes.
There's open source training run, and some colleagues of mine have found basically like you can cheaply find adversarial attacks. So like basically dumb Go bots that play in a way that confuses these like computer AI policies,
Hmm.
and these attacks, they're not like generally smart, but they just like push the right buttons on the AI policy.
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess this is more of a comment than a question, but like there's been enough rounds of like back and forth between like these authors and like the people making this open source Go bots that it's potentially interesting to just use that as a case study of the offense defense balance.
Yeah, so saying that, like,
Yeah,
given that the system was open source and that people can sort of use it and query it and then send the information back to the developers, that's
yeah, and in fact, like these authors have been working with
yeah.
the developers of this software, and in fact, what's happened is like the developments of this software, KataGo, if people want to Google it, that like they've seen this paper, they're like trying to implement patches like to fix these issues.
Yeah.
You know, the people finding the adversarial policies of like are basically checking if the fixes work and like publishing the
Yeah,
information about whether they do or not.
yeah, absolutely. So I want to be really clear that like this is a huge benefit of open source development is getting people like involved in the development process, but also using the system, finding the bugs, finding the issues, feeding that information back to the developers. Like this is a huge benefit of open source development for software and AI systems. I think that, this is specifically why the paper focuses on like the big, highly capable frontier foundation models, is that this
Hmm.
gets more difficult the more big, complex, cutting edge the system is. Like some bugs will still be relatively small, well defined, and there are, bug bounty programs, proposals for AI safety bounty programs as well, helping to find these vulnerabilities and give the information back to the developers. Yeah, I think it like there are issues though with respect to some of the larger safety issues that are more difficult. Like sometimes it's difficult to identify the safety problems in the first place, more
Yep.
difficult to address the safety problems. Then there's also the issue of just like rolling out the fixes to the system. So software development, you fix a bunch of bugs, you roll out an update. Oftentimes in the license, it'll say that you're supposed to actually use the updated version.
Hmm.
There's some data that came out. I can't remember which organization it was right now. I'll have to look it up later. But it's actually quite a low uptake rate of people actually running the up-to-date software. So first of all, like even with just normal software, it's hard to guarantee that people are actually going to run the up-to-date version and roll out those fixes, which is an issue with open source. Because like if you're using something behind API, then you just update the system and then everyone's using the updated system. If you have an open source system, then people actually have to download and run the updated version themselves. With foundation models, there's actually like a weird incentive structure that changes where people might actually be like de-incentivized to update. So with software, oftentimes when you have an update, it fixes some bugs and it improves system functionality. When it comes to safety fixes for foundation models, oftentimes it has to do with reducing system functionality, like putting on a
Hmm.
filter that says, well, now you can't produce this class of images. Now you can't do this kind of function with the system. So like it's hard, like I don't know if there's good information on how this is actually panned out now. Like are we seeing lower uptake rates with updates for AI systems? I don't know, but yeah, there might be something weird with incentive structures going on too, where if updates basically equate to reducing system functionality in certain ways, people might be less likely to actually take them on board.
Yeah, I don't have a good feel for
i i,
that.
I don't have a super good feel, but like just I don't know, interesting food for thought.
Yeah,
Perverse incentive structures.
the one case I don't know. I'm still thinking about this KataGo case. So like, so that's a case where the attack like does reduce the system functionality, and people like are interested in getting the
Yeah,
latest version
yeah.
with fixes. It also occurs to me that so in fact the structure of this paper, like the way they found the attack, did not rely on having access to the model weights. It relied
Hmm.
on basically being able to query the GoBot policy,
Yeah,
basically to try a bunch of things and figure out how to like trick the GoBot policy.
yeah,
Now, it's really helpful if you can have the weights locally, just so that you can call the API, so that you can like call it a lot.
yeah.
But that was not a case where you needed the actual weights to be shared. Which, so on the one hand, that's like a point that sharing the weights is like less valuable than you might think. But it also suggests like if you're worried about people finding like these adversarial attacks, then like just putting the weights behind an API doesn't protect you as much as you think. Like maybe you need to like rate limit or something.
Yeah, I think that's a valuable insight. Is there are definitely things you can do without weights.
Hmm.
I mean, this is an argument for why like you should be worried anyway. But it's also an argument for like there are lots of arguments for well, open sourcing is important because you need it to do safety research, and getting more people involved in safety research will result in safer systems. You have more people inputting to these processes. But like
Hmm.
you just illustrate a perfect example of how just having query access, for example, to a system can allow you to do a significant amount of safety research in terms of finding vulnerabilities. So like yeah, query access is one. Like that can be done completely behind an API. But then even if we think about something like interpretability research does require much more in-depth access to a system to do. But arguably, like this is an argument for needing access to smaller systems. We're struggling to do interpretability research on smaller, well-defined systems. It's sort of like like the rate limiting factor on interpretability research isn't the size of the models people have access to, the way I understand it, at least. Like if we're struggling to do interpretability research on smaller models, I feel like having access to the biggest, most cutting edge frontier model is not what needs to happen to drive interpretability research. So I mean,
Yeah, I think it
yeah, it'd
depends
just
on
be
the kind
interesting
of
to hear
interpretability
your thoughts on
research.
this as well. But like,
Yeah,
there's a range of different kinds of AI research. Not all of it requires open access, and then some of the kinds that does require open access to the models isn't necessarily the most like helped the most by having the open access. And then there are also like this idea of alternative approaches that we talk about in the paper. Like you can help promote AI safety research by providing access to like specific research groups, or like there are other things you can do to give people the access they need to do safety research.
yeah. So yeah, I guess I can share my impressions here. I think
Yeah,
so. I mean, interpretability research is like a broad bucket, right? It like
yeah,
describes a
yeah,
few different things. I think like there are some kinds of things where you know you want to start small, and we haven't like progressed that far beyond small, right? So just
yeah,
like understanding, like, can we just exhaustively understand how a certain neural networks start small? Don't start
yeah.
with GPT-4. But I think like one thing you're potentially interested in the interpretability context is
Hmm.
like how things get different as you get bigger models, or like yeah, do bigger models learn different things, or do
Yeah,
they learn more? Like what sorts of things start getting represented? Like, can we use interpretability to predict like these shifts? There, you do want bigger models. In terms of like how much can you do without access to weights? I mean, there's definitely a lot of interpretability work on these open source models because people apparently really do value having the
yeah,
weights. I think like I mean, even in the case of the adversarial policies work I was just talking about, like you don't strictly need access to the weights, but if you can, like if you can run the games of Go purely on your computer rather than like calling the API, like waiting for your request to be
yeah.
sent across the internet and the move to be sent back, and doing that a billion times, right? Or I don't know the actual number, but it seems like just
Much more
practically it's
efficient.
easier
Yeah,
to have the model. I also
yeah.
think that there are intermediate things. So one thing the paper talks about, and I guess your colleague Toby Chevlain has talked about, is basically
Hmm.
structured access of
Yeah,
giving certain kinds of information available to maybe to certain people, or like maybe you just say like these types of information are available, these types aren't. I mean, I've heard colleagues say like even if you didn't open source GPT-4 or GPT-3, just like providing like final layer activations or like
hmm,
certain kinds of gradients could be useful, which would
yeah.
not like I don't think that would provide all the dangers that or all the risks that open sourcing could potentially
Yeah, and
involve.
I think this is a really key point as well, is like trying to get past this open versus closed dichotomy. You know, just saying that something isn't open source doesn't necessarily mean that it's completely closed and no one can access it. Yeah, so like yeah, I said, like Toby Shevlin talks about structured access.
Hmm,
I know there's a paper we reference. At least when we referenced it, it was still forthcoming. It might be out now, but it was a Toby Shevlin and Ben Bucknell were working on it, and it
hmm,
was about the potential of developing research APIs. So
hmm,
how much access can you provide behind an API to enable safety research, and what kind of access would that need to look like, and how could those research APIs be regulated, and who by? So I think like if there's a genuine interest in promoting AI safety research and a genuine acknowledgement of the risks of open sourcing, we could put a lot of resources into trying to develop and understand ways to get a lot of the benefits to safety research that open sourcing would have by alternative means.
hmm.
It won't be perfect, uh, like this, but by definition, it's not completely open. But if we take the risks seriously, I think it's definitely worth looking into these alternative model sharing methods, and then also into the other kinds of proactive activities we can engage in to help promote safety research, whether that's committing a certain amount of fund to safety research or developing international safety research organizations and collaborative efforts. I know like one issue that always comes up when talking about like, okay, well, we'll just provide safety research access through API, or we'll provide privileged downloaded access to certain groups. It's like, well, who gets to decide who has access? Who gets to do
Yeah.
the safety research? And so I think this points to a need to like have some sort of a multi-stakeholder governance body to sort of mediate these decisions around who gets access to do the research, whether you're talking about academic labs or other private labs. Sort of like you have multi-stakeholder organizations decide how to distribute grants to do environmental research, or like, you have grant making bodies that distribute grant funds to different academic groups. You could have similar type situation for distributing access to more highly capable, potentially dangerous systems to academic groups, research groups, safety research institutions that meet certain standards and that can help further this research. So like I feel like if there's a will to drive safety research forward, and if
Hmm.
varying degrees of access are needed to allow the safety research to happen, there are things we can do to make it happen that do not necessarily require open sourcing a system. Yeah. And I think, like we said, there are different kinds of research. Safety research require varying degrees of access. It's not like all safety research can be done with little access. No, you
Yep.
need different amounts of access for different kinds of safety research. But if there's a will, there's a way.
Yeah. So I want to ask something like a bit more quantitative about that. Like, so some of the benefits of open sourcing can be gained by sort of halfway measures, or by like structured access, or like pursuing tons of collaborations.
Mhm.
But as you mentioned, like, it's not going to be the same as if it were open sourced. Do you have a sense of like, if you want to, I guess it's going to depend on like how constrained you are by safety, but how much of the benefits of open source do you think you can get with these more limited sharing methods?
I mean, that's a good question. I think you can get quite a bit. And I think, again, it sort of depends what kind of benefit you're talking about. So in the paper, I think we discuss three different benefits. Let's see, we talk about accelerating AI research. So that's safety research and capability research. We talk
Hmm.
about distributing influence over AI systems. And this sort of ranges everything from like control over AI system, like who gets to control the systems, who gets to make governance decisions about the systems, who gets to profit for it, kind of like wraps all the democratization themes together under distributing influence over AI. And then let's see, what was the other one that we talked about? You'd think I've talked about this paper enough in the last 3 months.
Yeah.
I'd have it down.
So my
External
notes.
model evaluation. There
Oh,
we
right.
go.
Yeah.
Yeah, so enabling like external oversight and evaluation. And I think it depends which one you're talking about. So, for example, if we're talking about maybe, okay, let's start with external model evaluation. I think that
Yep.
this probably benefits the most from open sourcing. It depends what you're looking at. So, for example, if you're just sort of looking for like minor bugs and stuff like that, like you don't need open source access for that. But having more in-depth view to the systems is more important for sort of trying to like help find fixes to the bugs. We've discussed this. There are also risks associated with open sourcing. If we're talking about accelerating capability research, for example, which sort of falls under the second category, I think you might find that like the benefits of open sourcing here might be somewhat limited. The larger and more highly capable the system gets, and I think this largely will just have to do with who has access to the necessary resources to really operate on the cutting edge of research and development. Like open source development, it operates sort of like behind the frontier right now, largely because of not restrictions, but just the expense of the necessary compute resources. And then you talk about distributing control over AI. We've already kind of discussed the more distributed effect of open sourcing and model sharing on distributing control. It's sort of like a second order effect. You get more people involved in the development process, and then large labs have more competition, and then it distributes influence and control. There are probably more like direct ways you can help distribute control and influence over AI besides making a system widely available. Yeah, so to answer your original question then about like how much of the benefit of open sourcing can you get through alternative methods? I guess it really depends what
Hmm.
benefit you're talking about. I think for like AI safety progress, probably quite a bit, honestly. Actually, the vast majority of it, given that a lot of the safety research that's done on these highly capable cutting edge models is something that has to happen within well resourced institutions anyway.
Hmm.
Or like you need the access to the resources to do that, not just the code and the weights, but the computational resources and so on. Yeah. So I think quite a bit. I think it's less of a can we get close to the same benefits that open sourcing allows? It's more of like, can we do it in one foul swoop? Open source, like, oh, that's the thing. It's like open sourcing is the easy option. Here, it's open, and now you get all these benefits from open sourcing. The decision to open source or not, like, the part of the reason it's a hard decision is because achieving these benefits by other means, it's harder. It's going to take more resources to invest. It's more organizational capacity, more thought, more cooperation, more like it's going to take a lot of infrastructure, a lot of effort. Yeah, it's not the one-stop shop that open sourcing is. But I think the idea is that if the risks are high enough, if the risks are severe enough, it's worth it. I think that's where it comes in. So I guess
Mm,
it's worth reiterating again and again. Like, this paper is not an anti-open source paper.
mm,
Very pro open source in the vast majority of cases. What we really care about here are like frontier AI systems that are starting to show the potential for causing really catastrophic harm. And in these cases, let's not open source and let's pursue some of these other ways of achieving the same benefits of open source to safety and distributing control and model evaluation. But if open source away below that threshold, the net benefits are great.
gotcha. So my next question, yeah, I actually got a bit sidetracked and wanted to ask it earlier, but so in terms of the offense defense balance, in
Mhm.
terms of like the harms that you are worried about from open sourcing, I sometimes hear the claim that like basically like look, AI, if you open source it, it is going to cause more harm, but you also enable more people to deal with the harm, right?
Mhm.
So I think they're talking about offense defense balance, not of like finding flaws in AI models, but in the underlying like issues that AI might cause, right? So I guess the idea is something to character it. It's something like, look, if you use your AI to create a pathogen, I can use my AI to create a broad spectrum antibiotic or something.
Mhm.
And the hope is that like in these domains where we're worried about AI causing harm, look, just open sourcing AI is going to enable tons of people to be able to deal with the harm more easily, as well as like enabling people to cause harm. So yeah, I'm wondering, what do you think about the sort of underlying offense defense balance as opposed to that within AI?
Yeah, I get the argument. I know. I'm personally I'm wary about the arms race dynamic, though.
Hmm,
You gotta constantly build the stronger technology to keep the slightly less strong technology in check. Yeah, I mean, I guess this comes back to like that very original question you asked about what about just hitting the no more AI button?
hmm,
um, yeah, so like I guess I get the argument for that. I think there's weird dynamics. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not doing a very good job answering this
right.
question. I'm just like I'm personally concerned
Fair
about the
enough.
race dynamic here, and I think it just sort of comes back to this issue of how hard is it to fix the issues and vulnerabilities in order to prevent the misuse in the first place. Like, I think that should be the goal, is preventing the
Hmm,
misuse, preventing the harm in the first place, not saying, can we build a bigger stick?
hmm,
I know this is also like there's a similar argument that is brought up when people talk about the benefits of producing increasingly capable AI systems and saying like, oh well, we need to plow ahead and build increasingly capable AI systems because you never know, we'll develop a system that'll help cure cancer or develop some renewable energy technology that'll help us address climate change or something like that, like this, like what huge problems could AI help us solve in the future. And I don't know, just I mean, and this is personally me, like I don't know what the other authors on this paper think of this, but I don't know, like I kind of feel like if those are the goals, if the goals are to solve climate change and cure cancer, take the billions upon billions upon billions and billions of dollars that are currently putting into training AI systems and go cure cancer and develop renewable technologies. And yeah, so I don't know, those I struggle with those arguments personally.
yeah,
I'd be interested just to hear your thoughts. Like, these are not like I have not written about this. I haven't, like,
sure.
this is me riffing right now.
Yeah,
So
I
I'd be
think
interested to hear your thoughts on this train of thought as well.
yeah, I mean, I think the original question is sort of like unfairly hard to answer just because like
Yeah.
it's sort of like asking about the offense defense balance of like any catastrophic problem AI might cause. And it's like, well, there are tons of those, and it's pretty hard to
Yeah.
think about, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, so the thing you were saying about like, if you wanted to cure cancer, maybe step one would not be create like incredibly, smart AI. Yeah, I think like if I've seen this point. I don't know if you know David Chapman's Better Without AI.
No, not familiar.
Yeah, so he basically argues like we just shouldn't build like big neural nets, and it's going to be terrible. I also Jeffrey Henninger at AI Impacts, I think, has said something similar along these lines.
Hmm.
I mean, on the one hand, like I do kind of get it, just in the sense that like if I weren't worried about misaligned AI, it's kind of like there's this hope that this is like the last invention you need. You know,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
create AI, and now like instead of having to separately solve cancer and climate change and whatever, you just like make it solve solve those things for you, right?
Yeah. I guess it's
So
just really hard to kind of look forward, and it's like you have to decide now whether or not this technology is that silver bullet and how much investment it's going to take to get to that point.
yeah, I think that's right, and I think that there's also just yeah, I think your take on this is going to be just driven by your sense of the risk profile of building
Hmm.
things that are just significantly smarter than us. I guess listener, from the fact that I made the like X risk research podcast rather than the AI, everything's going to be great research podcast. People can
It
guess
gives an
my
indication of where you're
take on
coming from.
this, but I don't know. I think it's a hard question. I think like so part of my take is like in terms of the underlying offense defense balance. I think it becomes more clear when you're worried about like what should I say, silicogenic risks, like basically like the AI itself, like coming up with issues rather than like
Yeah.
humans,
Yeah.
using AI to like have nefarious schemes. Like once you're worried about like AI doing things on their own where like you're not necessarily in control, like
Hmm.
there I think it makes sense that like you're probably if you're worried about not being able to control the AIs, you're probably not going to like be able to solve the risks that the AIs are creating, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Like your management plan for AI shouldn't be to build a slightly more powerful AI to manage your AI. Like you,
Yeah,
yeah.
or well, if you knew that like you were gonna remain in control of the like slightly bigger AI, like
Yeah.
maybe that's a plan, but
No, I
you kind
guess
of
I
want to
was
know
saying
that.
that like if you're worried about loss of control scenarios, then the solution shouldn't be, well, let's build another system that's also
Yeah,
out of our control but just slightly better aligned to to address
yeah,
like I feel
it's
like
not the
that's where you start.
greatest.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think my colleague John Wentworth has some saying like, releasing Mothra to contain Godzilla is not going to like increase property values in Tokyo, which is a cute little line. Yeah, it's I don't know. It's a hard question. I think it's hard to say anything very precise on the topic. I did want to go back to the offense defense balance. So moving back a bit, a thing you said was something like, "Look, it's probably better to just prevent threats from arising than it is to like have someone make a pathogen and then like have everyone race to create a like antibiotic or antiviral or whatever."
Hmm.
So that's one way in which like everyone having like really advanced AI. That's one way that could look in order to deal with threats. I think another way does look a bit more like prevention. I don't know. It's also more dystopian sounding, I guess. But one thing that AI is good at is surveillance, right?
Yes.
Potentially. So you could imagine, like, look, we're just going to open source AI, and what we're going to use the AI for is just like basically surveilling people to make sure that threats don't occur. So maybe one version of this is you just like really amp up wastewater, you know, somehow you use your AI to just look at the wastewater and see if like any new pathogens are arising.
Yeah.
It could look more like you have a bunch of AIs that can detect if other people are trying to use AI to create super weapons or whatever, and like stop them before they do
Yeah.
somehow.
But then why, like, I don't, okay, wastewater example, like, yeah, that sounds great. We should probably do that anyway. In terms of like, surveilling to see how people are using AI systems using AI,
Hmm.
why not just have the AI systems? be behind an API where people can use the systems for a variety of downstream tasks integrating through this API. And then the people who control the API can just see how the system is being used. Like
Yeah,
even if it can be used for a vast majority of tasks, like even if you were to take all the safety filters off, the advantage of the API is still that you can see how it's being used. That I don't know. I feel like
yeah,
that's
that seems like a good argument.
yeah.
All right, okay. So moving, I guess another question I have is related to the frame of the report. So in the report, you're basically like, okay, open sourcing has these benefits, but it also has like these costs. What are ways of like doing things other than open sourcing that basically try and retain most of the benefits while getting rid of most of the costs? You can imagine a parallel universe report where you say like, okay, open sourcing has these benefits, but it also has these costs. How can we're still going to open source, but we're going to do something differently in our open source plan that is going to retain benefits and reduce costs, right?
Yeah.
So like one example of this is you open source models, but you have some sort of watermarking or you have some sort of like cryptographic backdoor that can like stop models in their tracks or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering like, yeah, why the frame of like alternatives to open sourcing rather than like making open sourcing better?
Very simple. I think making open sourcing better is the harder question. Like
Makes
technically
sense.
more difficult. I mean, for example, say you have watermarking. Part of the issue with watermarking to like identify artificially generated images is making sure the watermarks stick. How do you make sure that they are irremovable? If you are going to open, like, this is a really complex technical question. How do you develop a system that has watermarked images where that watermark is irremovable if you were to open source the system? And I'm not saying it's undoable. I personally don't have the technical background to comment very deeply on this. I have heard people sort of talking about how possible this would be. It's also like it depends how you watermark, right?
Yeah.
If you have like just a line of inference code that says slap a watermark on this thing, like, yeah, okay, delete the line of inference code. If you're to train the system on images that like only watermarked images, well, now you have to retrain the entire system to get it to do something else, right? Which is very expensive. So again, I think it kind of like depends how you do it. I was at a
Yeah.
meeting last week where people were sort of talking about like, are there ways we could, like, I don't know, like build in mechanism into the chips that run the systems that say like, if some bit of code is removed or changed in this system, then like the chip burns up and won't run the system. Like
Mm,
are there ways we could, it's like, I'm not saying this is impossible, but really interesting technical question, really difficult, definitely beyond my area of expertise. But I think like if this is an approach we can take and say like there are ways to be able to open source a system and get all the benefits of open sourcing by just open sourcing and still mitigate the risks, I think that's great. I think it's just a lot more difficult. And we do actually talk, there's one aspect in which we kind of do take the flip
mm,
view in the report. And I think this is where we start talking about staged release of models.
yeah.
So state like you can undergo a staged release of a model where you put out a slightly smaller version of a model behind API, you study how it's being used, maybe you take a pause, analyze how it was used, what the most common avenues of attack, if at all, were being used to try and misuse the model, and then you release a slightly larger model, a slightly larger model. You do this iteratively. And if you do this process and you get to a stage where it's like, hey, we've been doing the stage release of this model for however many months, and no problems, looking good. There's no emergent capabilities that popped up that are making you worried. You didn't have to implement a bunch of safety restrictions to get people to stop doing unsafe things. Like, okay, open source. This is not a binary. Yes, it has to be completely open or completely closed. And I
Yeah.
think this is one respect. Like, if you were to take this flip view of how can we open source but do it in the safest way possible,
Mm,
just open source slowly. Take some time to actually study the impacts. And it's not like the only way to sort of get a sense of how the system's going to be used is to just open source it and see what happens. You could do a staged release and study what those impacts are. Again, it won't be perfect. You never know how it's going to be used 10 years down the road once someone gets access to all the weights and stuff, but it is
mm,
possible to study and get some sort of insight. And I think one of the nice things about stage release is like if you start doing the stage release process and you realize that, at each iterative step, you are having to put in a bunch of safety filters, for example, to prevent people from doing really shady stuff.
mm.
That's probably a good indication that it's not ready to be open sourced in its current form, because those are safety filters that will just immediately be reversed once open sourced. So yeah, I think you can get like you can learn a lot from that. So I think like that's one way you could open source safely, is find ways to actually study what the effects are before you open source, because that decision to open source is irreversible. And then yeah, I think the technical challenge of, are there ways we can sort of like have backstops that we can like technically build in, like irreversible, irremovable filters or watermarks, or even just like hardware challenges that we could implement. I think really interesting technical questions that I don't know enough about, but
Yeah.
go for it.
If
Like that'd be a great world.
Yeah, if listeners are interested, this gets into some territory that I talked about with Scott Aronson earlier this year. Yeah, I think like the classic difficulties, at least so for watermarking. I don't know. I read one paper that claims to be able to like bake the watermark into the weights of the model. I didn't really, to be honest, I didn't
Yeah.
actually understand how that worked. But
I think it has to do with how the model's trained. So the way I
yeah,
understand it is like if you have a data set of images that all have a watermark in that data set, like not watermark in the sense like you see on a $1 bill, but like
yeah,
like weird pixel stuff that the human eye can't see. If all the images in the training data set have that watermark, then all of the images it produce will
yeah,
have that watermark. So the only way to get rid of the water, like in that case, it's like it's baked into the system because of how it was trained. So the only way to get rid of that watermark would be to retrain the system on images that don't contain the watermark.
yeah. That's one possibility. So that's going to be a lot rougher for like applying to text models, of course, because
Yes,
like
yeah,
if you want to just
absolutely.
train
It all,
on like
yeah.
the whole internet, I think that like yeah, I think I saw something that claimed to work even on cases where the data set did not all have the watermark, but I didn't really understand how it worked. But at any rate, the key like kind of the key issue with these sort of watermarking methods is as long as there's one model that can basically paraphrase that does not have watermarking, then
Mhm.
you can just like take your watermark thing and basically launder it and get something that if your paraphrasing model is good enough,
Yeah,
you can create something that's like looks basically similar, doesn't have the watermark, and then then it's sad news. Yeah,
yeah.
and
I
then
mean,
yeah,
sorry, I was gonna say, like, there's, similar in terms of, like, how doing something with one model allows you to jailbreak another model kind of thing. I mean, this is what's happened with the adversarial suffixes paper, right?
hmm,
Where you have, using a couple open source models, one of which was Llama 2, and, using the weights of those models, figuring out a way to basically just throw, like, a random seemingly random string of numbers at a large language model, and then with that seemingly random range of numbers before the prompt, basically get the system to do whatever you want. Except while they figured out how to do that using the weights accessible from Llama 2, it worked on like all the other large language models. So,
hmm,
finding a way to kind of jailbreak one model and using the weights and access to one model that could bring up vulnerabilities in tons of others that aren't open sourced as well. I think that's just another roughly
yeah,
related somewhat to what we were just talking about point.
yeah. I guess it brings up this high level thing of like you want whatever governance method for AI you want it to be robust to like some small fraction of things not breaking the rules. Like you don't
Mhm,
want the small fraction to kind of poison the rest of the thing, which watermarking unfortunately has. Yeah, I guess I wanted to say something brief about backdoors as well. Like, so there is really a way of at least in toy neural networks, and you can probably extend it to bigger neural networks.
mhm,
You really can introduce a backdoor that is cryptographically just hard to
mhm.
detect. But so partly, I mean, one problem is like how do you actually use this to prevent AI harm is like not totally obvious. I guess the second issue only comes up with like super smart AI, but like if you have a file on your computer that's like I implanted a backdoor in this model, the backdoor is this input,
Yeah,
then you can then it's no longer cryptographically hard
yeah,
to find
yeah.
as long as somebody can break into your computer, which hopefully is cryptographically hard. But there are I guess there are security vulnerabilities there. So yeah, I wonder if you want to say a little bit about the safer ways to get the open source benefits. I've given you a chance to talk about them a little bit, but is there anything more you want to say about those?
Um, I think not really. I think it's just the overarching point is, just as said before, like if there's when the risks are high, And I think that's key to remember. I'm not saying don't open source everything. When the risks are high, it is worth investing in seeing how else we can achieve the benefits of open sourcing. Yeah, basically, if you're not going to open source because the risks are high, then look into these other options. It's really about getting rid of this open versus closed dichotomy. So many of the other options have to do with other options for sharing models, whether that's structured access behind API, even research API access, gated download, staged release, and then also more proactive efforts which can actually also be combined with open sourcing. They don't have to be seen as an alternative to open sourcing. So this is things like redistributing profits towards AI safety research, or starting AI safety and bug bounty programs, or even like we talked about with the democratization paper, thinking about how we can democratize decision making around AI systems to help distribute influence over AI away from large labs, which is another argument for open sourcing. And so, yeah, I think that this is key. It's just like there are other efforts that can be put in place to achieve many of the same benefits of open sourcing, and when the risks are high, it's worth really looking into these.
All right. Okay, so moving on, I want to just talk a little bit more broadly about the field of AI governance research. So, historically, this podcast is mostly focused on technical AI alignment research, and I imagine most listeners are more familiar with the technical side than with governance efforts.
Oh, in which case I apologize for all my technical inaccuracies. One of the benefits of having 25 co-authors is that
Hmm,
a lot of the technical questions I got to outsource.
makes sense. Yeah, it's good to be interdisciplinary. But so this is kind of a broad question, but like, how is AI governance going? Like what's the state of the field? If you can
The
answer that
state of the
briefly.
field of AI governance. Um, yeah, okay, I'll try and answer that briefly. It's going well in that people are paying attention.
Okay.
Yeah, in this respect, like the release of ChatGPT, I think was really great for AI governance because people besides those of us already doing AI governance research are really starting to see this as something valuable and important that needs to be talked about, and questions around what role should governments play in regulating AI, if at all? How do we get this balance between governments and the developers? Who should be regulated with respect to different things? Do all of the responsibilities lie on the developers, or is it on the deployers? And like all of these questions suddenly are they're coming to light, and there's more general interest in them. And so we're seeing things like, the UK AI summit is happening next week, global AI summit looking at AI safety, really concerned about catastrophic and existential risks, trying to understand what kind of global institutions should be in place to govern AI systems, to evaluate AI systems, to audit, to regulate. And this is bringing in countries from all over the world. I think it's something like 28 different countries are going to be at the UK AI summit.
Hmm.
You have the EU AI Act, where it started a while ago looking at narrow AI systems, but now is taking on foundation models and frontier AI systems and looking at open source regulation. And this has really, like over the last year, exploded into a global conversation. So in that respect, AI governance is going well in that people are paying attention. It's also very high stress because suddenly everyone's paying attention. We have
Hmm.
to do something. And so, but I think there's really genuine interest in getting this right, and that I think that really bodes well. So I'm excited to see where this next year goes. Yeah, I think there's talk about having this global AI summit and then making this a recurring series, and yeah, so I think it's going well in the sense that people are paying attention, and the wheels are starting to turn, and that's cool.
Okay. I guess related to that, what do you see as like the most important like open questions in the field?
In the field of AI governance, okay, so I think like one big one is compute governance, which my colleague Leonard Heim works on. So this is just thinking about how compute is a lever for trying to regulate who is able to develop large models, even like how compute should be distributed so that more people can distribute large models, but basically using compute as a lever to understand who has access to and who is able to develop different kinds of systems. So I think like that's a huge area of research with a lot of growing interest, because compute's just sort of like is one of the tangible things that we can actually control the flow of. I think that the questions around model sharing and open sourcing is getting a lot of attention right now. Big open question, a lot of debate. Like I said, it's becoming really quite a polarized discussion. So it's getting quite hard to cut through. But a lot of good groups working on this. And I think a lot of interest in like genuinely finding common ground to start working on this. So like when I get in, I've had a couple situations where I've been in groups or workshops where we get people who are, very pro open source and other people who are just like, no, let's just shut down the whole AI system right now. Like really both sides of the spectrum coming together. And we try and find a middle ground on, okay, where do we agree? Is there a point where we agree? And very often we can come to a point of agreement around the idea that there may be some AI system, some model that poses risks that are too extreme for that model to be responsibly open sourced. And that might not
Mm,
sound like that extreme of a statement, but when you have
mm,
people coming from such polarized views to agree on the fact that there may exist a model one day that should not be open sourced, that is a starting point. and you
mm,
can and you can start the conversation from there. And every group I've been in so far has got to that point, and we can start working on that. So I think this model sharing question is a big open question, and like lots of technical research needs to be done around benchmarking to decide like when are capabilities too dangerous, also around understanding like what activities are actually possible given access to different combinations of model components, and that's actually not entirely clear.
mm,
And we need a much more fine-grained understanding of what you can actually do given different kinds of model combinations of model components, in order not only to have safe standards for model release and really fine-grained standard for model release, but also to protect the benefits of open sourcing. You don't want to just have a blanket, don't release anything, if you can get a lot of good benefit out of releasing certain model components. So I think a lot of technical research has to go into this. Anyway, so yeah, second point, I think model sharing is a really big point of discussion right now. And then with the upcoming UK AI Summit, quite a bit of discourse around what international governance structures should look like for AI. A lot of different proposed models. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see what comes out of the summit. I don't think they're going to agree on anything amazing at the
mm.
summit. It's 2 days. um, but I think for me, a really great outcome of the summit would be, first, recognition from everyone that AI systems could pose really extreme risks. So just a recognition of the risks. And then second, a plan going forward, a plan for how we can start establishing international systems of governance and sort of like really structure out when are we going to come to what kinds of decisions, and how can we start putting something together. So yeah, I think that those are probably three key open questions. And the international governance structure one is really big right now too, just
Right.
given the upcoming summit.
Yeah, and I guess unless we get the editing and transcription for this episode done unusually quickly, listeners, the UK AI Summit is almost definitely going to be in your past. So I guess listeners are in this interesting position of knowing how that all panned out in a way that we don't. So that was open questions in the field broadly. I'm wondering, for you personally as a researcher, what things are you most interested in looking at next?
Interesting. I mean, most of my life is kind of taken up with like follow up on this open source report right now.
Okay.
So I definitely want to keep looking into questions around model sharing and maybe setting responsible scaling policy, responsible model release policy. I'm not exactly sure. I think I'm kind of in this place right now where I'm trying to feel out where the most important work needs to be done, and whether like the best place for me to do is like to encourage other people to do certain kinds of work where I don't necessarily have the expertise, like we were talking about, like needing the more technical research into what is possible given access to different combinations of model components, or like are there specific areas of research I could try to help lead in, or whether really what needs to be done is just more organizational capacity around these issues. So no, I'm personally interested in sort of like keeping up with this model sharing discussion. I think there's a lot of interesting work that needs to be done here, and it's a key thing that's being considered within the discussions around international AI governance right now. Yeah, so sorry I don't have as much of a clear-cut answer there, but yeah, I'm still sort of reeling from having published this report and then everything that's coming off the back of it, and just trying to see, yeah, just trying to feel out where's the next most important, most impactful step? What work needs to be
Hmm.
done? So I guess if any of your listeners have really hot takes on, like, oh, this is what you should do next, I guess please tell me.
Yeah.
To be very helpful.
How should they tell you if someone's just heard that and they're like, oh, I need to.
I need to tell her now. She
Yeah.
must know. um, yeah, so I mean, I have a website where you can find a lot of my contact information, or you can always find me on LinkedIn. I spend far too much time on LinkedIn these days,
Okay.
and also my email address happens to be on the open source report. So if you download the report, my email address is there.
Okay. And what's the URL of your website?
ElizabethSeger.com.
All right. Okay. Getting back to talking about governance in general, I'm wondering. So, I guess this is an X-risk focused podcast. How, if at all, do you think governance research looks different when it's driven by concerns about X-risk mitigation versus other concerns you could have about AI governance?
Well, that's a good question. Let's see. So the question is like, how does the governance research look different?
Yeah, like what kinds of different questions might you focus on, or what kinds of different focuses would you have that would be driven by X-risk worries rather than by other things?
I mean, so this is something that, I've had to think about a lot in my own research development, because I did not come into this area of research from sort of like an X risk background interest.
Okay.
I came into it. I mean, honestly, I started in bioethics and then sort of moved from bioethics looking at AI systems in healthcare, and have sort of like
Mm,
moved over into the AI governance space, over a very long PhD program. And so here I am. But I would say, like, one of the things that I've learned working in the space, more interested in long term X risk impacts of AI, and trying to prevent X risks, is really paying attention to causal pathways, and really trying to be very critical about how likely a potential pathway is to actually lead to a risk.
mm,
I don't know if I'm explaining this very well, but I guess it's starting from a point. Maybe a better way of saying it is, like, if you have a hypothesis, or like, let's say you're worried about the impacts of AI systems on influence operations or impacting political campaigns. I
mm,
find it really helpful to start from the hypothesis of it won't have an impact,
mm,
and then and really just trying to understand how that might be wrong, as opposed to kind of trying to start from, like, oh, AI is going to pose this massive threat to, I don't know, to, it's going to pose a massive bio threat, or it's going to pose a massive threat to political operations or something like that. And then almost trying to, like, prove that conclusion.
mm.
Yeah, I don't know. I start sort of from the opposite point and then try and think about all the ways in which I could be wrong. And I think this is really important to do, especially when you're doing X risk research, whether it's with respect to AI, or some other form of X risk. Because I think there are a lot of people that turn off when you start talking about existential risks. They think it's too far out there. It's not really relevant to the important questions that are impacting people today, the tangible things that people are already suffering. And so I think it's really important to be very, very rigorous in your evaluations, and have a very clear story of impact for why it is that you're doing the research you're doing, and focusing on the issues that you're doing. And at least that's been my experience, sort of trying to transition into the space and work on these issues.
Okay. Another question I have, I guess, related to my audience. So I think my audience, a lot of them are technical alignment researchers,
Mhm.
and maybe they want to. There are various things they could do, right? And maybe they're interested in, okay, what work could technical alignment people do that would make AI governance better? I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that question.
Okay, technical alignment people, AI governance better. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work going in right now, especially within the UK government. Like, we just set up the UK AI task force, and it's sort of like a government institution doing a lot of model evals and alignment research. I think, like, if you have the technical background in alignment research, there's you are very much needed in the governance space. There's very often a disconnect between, I mean, I am also guilty of this. There's a disconnect between the people doing the governance research and the people who have the experience with the technology, and, like, really know the ins and outs of the technology that's being discovered, not being discovered, that's being developed. Sorry.
Yep.
And I think, if you have the inclination to work in an AI governance space and help bridge that gap, that would be incredibly valuable. And like I've already said, like some of the more technical questions, even around open sourcing, are things that, I was very, very glad to have colleagues, co-authors on the paper who do work with, develop, have worked for AI labs and stuff before, and really like knew what they were talking about and could advise and help write some of the more technical aspects of the report.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I think like if you have the inclination to work in these space, to get involved with governance efforts, or even maybe some of these government institutions that are starting to pop up that are working on the boundary of AI governance and technical research, that could be a really valuable place to contribute. Yeah, so I think like those my 2 cents off the top of my brain would be help bridge that gap.
Okay, great. So before we wrap up, I'm wondering if there's anything that you wish I'd asked, but that I didn't.
Oh, that's a good question. No, I don't think so. Like I think we've covered a lot of good stuff. Yeah, I just thank you for having me on, really. I'd say there's nothing in particular. This has been great.
All right. So to wrap up, then, if people are interested in following your research, following up on this podcast, how should they do that?
Yeah, like I said, so I have my website, elizabethseger.com. It sort of outlines my different ongoing research projects, has a lot of publications on it. Also, GovAI's website, governance.ai, is a wealth of information, all things AI governance, from all of my great colleagues at GovAI and our affiliates. So really, yeah, there's new research reports being put out almost every week, maybe every other week, but like really high quality stuff. So you can find a lot of my work on the GovAI website, or my current work and past work on my own website, or find me on LinkedIn. Yeah, just happy to talk more.
All right. Well, thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Great, thank you.
This episode is edited by Jack Garrett, and Amber Dawn Ace helped with transcription. The opening and closing themes are also by Jack Garrett. Financial support for this episode was provided by the Long-Term Future Fund and Lightspeed Grants, along with patrons such as Tor Barstad, Alexei Malafeyev, and Ben Weinstein-Rohn. To read a transcript of this episode, or to learn how to support the podcast yourself, you can visit axrp.net. Finally, if you have any feedback about this podcast, you can email me at feedback@axrp.net.